Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. We are delighted to have you with us this morning for us in New York, this afternoon and this evening for other regions. We have Michael Bamberger here with us this morning, which is absolutely great. And we, on behalf of UNICEF and EVAL SDGs, we welcome Michael and we express him our appreciation for his valuable contribution. And we welcome all of you to the webinar series, Evaluation and Complexity in the SDGs Era, Part 2, Applying Complexity Responsive Evaluation to the SDGs. We will have, as usual, as Michael has offered for the first webinar, we'll have the possibility to, when the moderator indicates, to express comments in English, in French, in Portuguese, and in Spanish, if that facilitates the expression of comments for some of you. The responses, however, for the benefit of the audience, will be in English. Today we will have Kasem El Sadiq as the moderator for this webinar. Kasem El Sadiq is an international expert in policy and program evaluation. He has provided consulting services to various complex programs and technical assistance globally. He is a founding member of EVAL MENA, and he is also the vice chair of EVAL SDGs. Currently, he is coordinating EVAL Partners' flagship programs. Kasem has contributed to various policy papers and forums and is the co-author of the evaluation briefings produced by EVAL SDGs and IIED. Kasem, thank you very, very much, and Kasem will introduce our presenter and our discussant today. Thank you. Over to you, Kasem.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Shada, for the presentation. And I'm delighted today to have this crowd of people around and to have Michael with us. This is the second presentation or second webinar with Michael. Quickly, for those who don't know Michael Bamberger, he's been doing evaluation throughout his life. In various parts of the world. After retiring from the World Bank, after 22 years of work with the World Bank, he started consulting with many UN bilaterals and government agencies and NGOs, and he's been publishing widely on development and evaluation, and serving on the advisory board of many leading evaluation journals. Michael is a member of the UNDP Independent Evaluation Office, International Evaluation Advisory Committee, and he recently is co-authoring a book on the topic of today, basically dealing with complexity in development evaluation. And we're gonna take this opportunity basically to pick up on Michael's extensive history and extensive experience in this subject. His book, he offers practical guidance to policymakers, managers, and evaluation practitioners on how to design and implement complexity-responsive evaluation that can be undertaken in real life and given the political constraints, etc. I'm pretty sure that many of us know Michael's. I will not take time of much of time in presenting him. And this is Michael Bamberger. The floor is open for Michael now, and allow me to say that I'll be moderating the session and probably interfering here and there, just to give a time for people to express their views and comments. This would be an interactive session. Thankfully, Michael agreed that we run this on 2 or 3 phases. So let's give a warm welcome to Michael. Michael, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for those of you who've had to get up very early, or those of you who are staying up very late. Today, this is the second part of the discussion of complexity and the application to the SDGs. Last session, we talked about some of the general approaches to complexity and tried to demystify complexity, showing it is something which people can actually use in their evaluations, even if you're not an expert on complexity theory. So today, this will be coming back to this. This is how you use network analysis for looking at the relationships between SDGs, and we'll be coming back to that. So today the plan is I'm going to go through a very quick recap of what we discussed in the last session, and the presentation will be available to you, so I'm not going to go through in any detail. And then I'm going to be giving a brief introduction to systems analysis approaches, which is one of the essential elements of thinking about complexity, and something which a lot of evaluators are maybe not too familiar with. Then we'll have a short break facilitated by Kassem for any initial questions. And then I will talk about user-friendly approaches for using complexity for evaluating the SDGs. Then we'll open up for discussions and for some comments from the discussant. And then if there's time, I would like to come back and give an example of how complexity analysis has actually been used in this case in a 10-year program to combat violence against women. So we'll try to show how this can actually be done on the ground. So this is the plan. So we'll break the presentation into two parts. We're very anxious to get your comments and feedback and suggestions as we go along. And so thank you to Kassem for facilitating and keeping us on track. So just a very quick recap of what we discussed in the first session. We talked about a complexity map, that there are four main dimensions of complexity. On the blue, the intervention itself, which can have complex dimensions. The relationships between the institutions and the stakeholders, which can get very, very complex and challenging. The system within which the program operates, the political, economic, environmental, migratory systems, which is a big challenge for any program, particularly a very large program like the SDGs. And then the challenges of understanding causality. There are many different inputs, many different outcomes, and many different relationships between the inputs and the outcomes. There isn't a clear linear causal path as you get in simpler evaluations. And then over all of this is the complexity of the evaluation process itself. So this is just an example of some of the dimensions of complexity in one of the four areas we talked about, the institutional and stakeholder dynamics, the relationships between all of the different agencies involved in the evaluation of the program. Firstly, there are many different stakeholders with different priorities. Sometimes they may be competing with each other, sometimes they just don't coordinate very well. The political dynamics, in some areas the program may have the support of the local mayor, who's a member of the government party. In another area, the opposition party may control the municipality, and they may not be so enthusiastic about supporting the program. Then there's a question of which of the organizations, of the actors, decides what is going to be, what indicators are going to be used, and who will be interpreting them and how. Then all of the challenges of the multiple sources of funding. Often it's not quite clear how the funding is supposed to be used, how it's going to be managed. Then in many cases a lot of pressure just to collect monitoring data rather than to focus on impact. This is a priority interest of a lot of the stakeholders. And then the sad fact that many of the agencies have very little interest in sustainability, even though this is in the title of the SDGs. So this is just an example of some of the multiple complexity factors which you may have to look at, in this case in relationship to the institutions and stakeholder dynamics. There are a similar range of issues for the other dimensions. Then we talked briefly about a checklist which can be used to measure the level of complexity on each of the dimensions. There's a set of indicators, and the checklist is available, which enables you to come up with some initial estimate of how complex each of the dimensions is, rather than just saying the program's very complex without having a clear idea of what you actually mean by that. And then finally, we talked about a 5-step process for evaluating the complexity of programs. You begin by mapping the different dimensions of complexity, and then you can try and unpack a complex program into a number of different components, each of which you can evaluate separately, selecting whichever standard evaluation approach you think will be most useful. Then you have the challenge of reassembling the different the findings of the different component evaluations, and then going back to the big picture. So this is the 5-step evaluation approach which we were discussing, and we'll give an example of this at the end when we talk about the evaluation of the program to address violence against women. So that very quickly is what we talked about in the first session, and now I'd like to give a very brief introduction to systems analysis, which everybody agrees is an essential component of a complexity analysis. So I'm going to go through very quickly a number of different approaches to systems analysis, and just recognizing that it's quite challenging to use any of these approaches just because we have 4 different dimensions of complexity. We have to model complex processes across many different organizations and behavioral changes. There's many different SDGs and sub-indicators of SDGs, all of which interact with each other. We find that there are some critical points of bottlenecks and areas of leverage for strengthening the relationships between SDGs, many contextual factors affecting implementation, and then we have to model change over long periods of time. And finally, we'll keep coming back to this issue of emergence, the fact that the programs you're evaluating are constantly changing. So these are some of the challenges for trying to apply a complexity evaluation to a program as ambitious as the SDGs. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly about each of these 5 approaches. You could spend a whole day or a week on any one of these. So just to give you a flavor of some of the different approaches, and these are critical at the beginning of any complexity evaluation. You have to begin with some kind of systems analysis to understand what it is that the dimensions of complexity that we're looking at. So firstly, systems mapping. This is an example we'll come back to for the violence against women. You identify all of the different actors, agencies involved, and then you try to map the relationships between them, the communication patterns, the flows of information, of resources. You can use dotted lines if it's a negative relationship between the organizations, solid line if it's a positive relationship. You can make the lines thicker if the relationships are stronger, thinner lines if the relationships are not so strong. So you can begin to map the relationships between all of the different agencies involved in the program you're looking at. And these are some of the ways that you can use this kind of systems analysis. You can look at the frequency, intensity of the communication between the different actors. You can look at how many of the interactions between different agencies or offices or people are positive, negative, or neutral. You can look at how many of the communications are commands, how many of them are providing technical information, how many of them are network building. You can look at how you may move towards decentralization of control as the program evolves, and you can look at whether the communications are mainly top-down or bottoms-up. So this is a tool which is very useful for giving you some overall understanding of the dynamics of the programs that you're looking at and how these change over time. All of these systems analysis approaches need to be dynamic. You need to keep going back and looking at the changes rather than just doing the map at the beginning of the evaluation and then forgetting about it. The second approach is systems dynamics. This is an example with a micro loans program. The idea of this is you're looking at feedback loops. You have the popularity of the program. You try to promote, increase the popularity. There's a plus there. This increases, you hope, the loans given. When you increase the number of loans given, this increases the financial liabilities of the agencies managing the loans, and This may increase the stringency of the loan conditions, and then you can see this may reduce the demand for the loans if the conditions become more strict, and this may reduce the popularity of the program. So these are continuous feedback loops which strengthen or affect negatively the program as it evolves. So this systems dynamics, these can obviously get much more complex, but this is a way of looking at the relationships between the different components of a program, how they interact with each other. The third systems approach is social network analysis, where you look at communication patterns between the different actors. Each of these circles, it could be an SDG, it could be an agency, it could be a community, it could be an individual, and again, you look at whether how strong the communication links are, whether they're positive or negative. And you can see here at the top left, there's quite strong interactions between one group. On the right, there's another group which has interactions among them, some of them positive, some of them negative. Then there's a number of the green, where there's very limited interaction between those different things. So you can see how these change over time. You can see whether there are different conflicting groups, whether some groups have more influence than others, and you can see this may require some actions to go and strengthen the linkages between the different groups. So social network analysis is a very powerful tool. You can use it at the community level to look at the communication flows within a community, who are the opinion leaders, who are the different conflicting groups within a community. I'm sure you can think about different ethnic groups in a community, for example. So this is another very useful way of looking at a different aspect of systems. The fourth, and there are just one more after this, it's a rather frightening name, critical systems heuristics, but this basically means understanding the boundaries between the different of how broad the boundaries are of what you're studying. This is very critical because many evaluations have very narrow boundaries. You only look at the specific target group, and so things which are going on in the broader community you may be missing. If you broaden the boundaries to look at the secondary level, you can be looking at the effects on other household members or other people in the community. You can go through the tertiary level, looking at the effects on other communities. You can go to the macro level, looking at the effects of the regions or at the national level. This is very critical because many evaluations have very narrowly defined boundaries, and so you're just ignoring many of the positive or sometimes the negative effects which are going on beyond the boundaries which you've defined. And so boundaries are based upon value judgments, and so this turns out to be one of the most critical issues when designing a complexity evaluation. What exactly are you going to be studying? And we'll come back to this, but it's a very critical issue. Then the final systems analysis approach is network mapping. This is a rather frightening map of all of the SDGs, the main linkages between each of the SDGs. As you'll see in a minute, we can look at which of these relationships are strong, which are weak, which are positive, which are negative, which are neutral. But to remind us that even if you're only interested in education, education is affected very critically by transport, by health, by many other environmental issues, transport. So you really need to be keeping in mind how the SDG you're looking at is affected by many others. Many people don't do that. You have your silo mentality. I only work on education. I don't care what's happening in the other areas. So if you're trying to understand the overall impacts of something like the SDGs, it's really critical to be looking at all of these interactions. This is a system which was developed by the International Council for Science for trying to understand and rate the interactions between the different SDGs. +3 is where the relationships between two SDGs are indivisible. +2, where they reinforce each other. +1, where they're enabling. And then you can have 3 levels of negative. So you can look at which of the SDGs are supporting each other, which are constraining. And this is very, very important for understanding the overall dynamics. This, just to wrap up the first part, is an example. If you're looking at SDG 2, the zero hunger, you can see that hunger positively interacts with poverty eradication, with health promotion, and with education. There are positive linkages between all of those, but there can be some negative linkages with, for example, agriculture. If you're increasing the production of food, which is obviously essential for zero hunger, this increases greenhouse gas. About 20 to 35% of greenhouse gases are caused by agriculture. Cattle ranching to increase the production of meat can have very negative effects on the ecosystem or the forest conservation. So we can see this is just a way to begin to start looking at the interactions between the different SDGs. So this is just a brief introduction to systems analysis, which is an essential component of the evaluation of SDGs. We'll now take a break. I'll pass you back to Kassem, and then after that I'll talk for a little while about how you can actually put this into practice. It looks rather scary, but some simple steps for how you can actually start to think about conducting a complexity evaluation of the SDGs. So thank you, and over to you, Kassem.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, you nail it. It's exactly 15 minutes. You were exactly on time. I mean, the floor now is open for probably a bit of Q&A, a bit of clarification. We've learned so far a quick intro about a couple of frameworks and systems that would help us in trying to understand or to map a situation pertaining to the complexity of the SDGs. I think any quick remarks, burning remarks, feedbacks that we can, if you have any question, probably if you just either identify yourself, drop it on the conversation notes. Celeste, would you help me, if you don't mind, in identifying who's trying to raise hands, probably?
No worries. I'll help you there. But as of now, I don't see any questions in the questions and answer in the chat room. But participants can either type in the chat or unmute themselves. Thank you.
I'm sure Kassem also may have a question to get us going.
There you go.
Yep.
Oh, there's one here now.
Yeah, there is one by here now. Yeah.
Yes.
The question would be, what about the evolution of these relationships and the interactions with other contextual factors? Because we've talked about the complexity of the SDGs, and the point here is that the system analysis seems to be focused on relationship among stakeholders, positive, negative, and neutral. What about the evolution of these relationships and the interactions with other contextual factors?
Are we gathering all questions like about?
Probably.
Theorno has a question.
There is only one question here, and probably it would be good to make use of this time to address a Theorno question, and probably to call another Salome, another colleague. We had another question. The question is, if there is a plan to develop any guidance to further explain the elements under each dimension of the checklist. I think this question has to do with the reference, probably. Mike, would you please address these two questions, because this is we're still starting the discussion. We still have a long way to go, but probably addressing these two questions, and let's move on.
Yes. So,
just identify yourself in case they don't know.
Yes, this is Ada Ocampo from UNICEF and Eva SDGs. Just a reference to the checklist. We have sent the checklist to all of you to receive your inputs, and we are keen to consolidate your inputs to send them to Michael. So far, we have just received one or two from the last webinar, so we were waiting until this webinar to receive your inputs, And if we can talk for of a deadline, so a week from now, you can have 1 week to send your inputs. That will help us to consolidate and to send your inputs and your questions to Mike. We will encourage you that any question you have related to the checklist, you send us to me at Ocampo, AOCAMPO, @unicef.org, and not directly to Michael, because I'm in charge of the compilation. Thank you very much in advance. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. It takes a little while to think about some of these ideas if you're not very familiar with them. So, two essential things with any kind of systems analysis. The first, which is very important, the purpose of all of these approaches is to understand how the systems evolve over time. Many organizations bring in a consultant at the beginning, and she does a beautiful model with many different colors of all of the systems analysis, and then she goes away. Nobody ever looks at this again. It's helpful just to begin thinking about the program, but it doesn't really do justice to what you can do with systems analysis. The whole point of systems analysis is that these are all dynamic relationships which are changing over time. A lot of you have probably worked with the concept of emergence. Emergence means that any program you're looking at, even the most simple one, is evolving and changing over time. People interact, the intended beneficiaries interact with the system, and the system changes according to their interactions. If a lot of mothers come to the clinic and they complain about the services, then it's quite likely that the services will change. Maybe new groups are brought in that hadn't been thought of initially. Some organizations become very resistant. They don't like criticisms, and they go back into their shell and they become very defensive. You can see that the communication becomes more negative, or there are less communications. You hope that the systems are going to open up and relationships are going to become stronger. So the whole essence of any kind of systems analysis is you're looking at how things evolve. You identify areas. For example, you see maybe some of the communities have almost no linkages with the program. Some of the agencies have very few communications. So it's a tool for helping you to identify the issues you need to focus on. So that's really critical. I mentioned that, but didn't have time to go into it. But that really is critical. If you just do systems analysis once, it's of very little practical use. The other point which Kassem brought up, which is I mentioned at the beginning with the systems mapping, the 4 dimensions. One of the dimensions is always the complexity of the system within which your program is operating. There's a political system, there's an environmental system, maybe there are conflicts in the area, there's an election coming up and the political parties change, you have migration patterns, you have water has been put into some communities and you get conflicts with other communities about the water. I was working in Eritrea where there was a big conflict over water between the cattle herders and the farmers. So all of these factors are really critical, and it's particularly vital because many organizations just work on their program and they ignore the system in which it is functioning. So that is very critical, and so thank you for bringing that up. So I don't know if we have time for a couple more questions or comments.
I think let's move on with the next phase of the presentation, and we can park the question. There is an interesting questions pertaining to the lag in findings versus the reality that we're gonna probably address it later on once you walk us through the complexity of the SDGs.
Okay. Well, a lot of questions will start coming to their minds, and I'm more than happy to look at the questions after the webinar as well, and we can think about in some way of responding if a lot of questions come up. So in this second part, I'm going to begin to think about how you can actually think about a strategy for evaluating the SDGs within this complexity framework. Then we'll have a longer period for questions and discussion, and then I would like a few minutes towards the end to just give this example of how you can actually apply this framework to the example of the program to combat violence against women. So these will be a few initial ideas of how to think about putting all of these scary ideas into practice. And the message is that there are user-friendly ways that you can actually use complexity analysis. So where to begin? We've got these 17 SDGs. There's maybe 200 or more targets. Everything's changing over time, working in many different communities, different levels. So how do we think what we're going to start on? So the first thing is to define our focus. Are we going to be evaluating a single target? As you know, each of the SDGs has a number of specific targets. So for example, a target could be SDG 5.2, eliminating violence against women. So we could focus on a specific target, a particular feeding program, a particular initiative for strengthening transport, improving educational systems. So we could have a very narrow focus. We could look at a single SDG, for example, the goal 2, ending hunger. We could look at a group of related SDGs, for example, relationships between poverty, combating hunger, education, and gender, and we could look at how all of those interact with each other. Or we could be very ambitious and look at all of the SDG program in a particular country or a particular region. So it's very important to think what is our focus, and it's not the evaluator who decides this, it's the consultations with all of the key stakeholders. So avoid a temptation just to say we've got a lot of data on education, why don't we start with education? You begin with what are the critical decisions that the agency, the country has to make, and then decide what you're going to focus on. Then what is the level we're going to work at? Are we going to take one level? For example, we could just look at how a particular SDG is working at the local level in a particular village or a province. We could look at a regional level. We could look at the national level. So these are very different. We could look at the interactions among the different levels. We could start at the top, the national level of the education programs, and look at how they work their way down to the local level. We could start at the bottom and work our way up. So there's a number of key decisions which have to be made, and I keep emphasizing these are not made by the evaluator. The evaluator doesn't say, you know, I like working at the community level, so let's start at the community level. It's the stakeholders, the key decision makers, who decide what information do they need to have. So that's the first thought. Then, as we mentioned earlier, defining boundaries is very critical. Many agencies say, we have this program which is targeted to try to get girls in 5 villages to go to school by providing school breakfast. Let's just focus on that. So that could be a very, very narrow focus, which a lot of agencies feel comfortable with. We could say, no, this program is going to have effects on other families in the community. Maybe we look at the secondary level, but it's also going to affect surrounding communities, or maybe we want to look at it at the macro level. So this decision is really critical, and I mentioned this several times because many agencies have a temptation to say, just look at our program. We don't want to waste time and money looking at broader areas which we don't affect. But all programs have many effects beyond the one which you're measuring. So it's very critical to think whether you want to try and capture the broader effects. In my experience, one of the biggest limitations of people thinking about things like the SDGs, you just focus on one narrow objective and forget that you are actually working with SDGs which have a very broad focus. So this is very critical. This depends on values. For example, if you're concerned about issues of inclusion, of ethnicity, or of gender, you probably need to have a broader focus, because many of the influences are not just on the 200 women taking the literacy course, they're on the whole community or the whole region. So really spend some time thinking about that, and so this tends to be one of the biggest challenges. Then, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, the importance of a mixed methods approach. One of the things I'm a little bit concerned about with the SDGs, so many people have spent so long collecting quantitative data that they then say we're going to have to spend all of our time just analyzing all of this quantitative data, and you never go into the communities, you never use participant observation, you never do in-depth interviews, you never do focus groups, you just analyze all of your quantitative data. So you need quantitative data, you need to be able to look at the breadth of the program, but you also need to understand the processes, you need to observe how programs evolve over time, you need to understand who is participating, who is not participating. Whenever I go to a community meeting, I always find you get as much benefit from talking to people who didn't come to the meeting, who are hanging around outside, and they say, I couldn't come to the meeting because I'm not a member of the government party, or somebody told me you have to be a Catholic before you come to this meeting, or you have to be a Muslim, which may not be true, but the people who are being excluded from the program can be as important as those who are benefiting. So a mixed method approach is critical, and so avoid the temptation saying, my goodness, we've just got so much data, it's going to take us all of the time we've got just to analyze all of this data, we can't even think about going to the communities or actually talking to anybody. Your evaluation is going to be a disaster if all you do is look at the quantitative data sitting in your office in the capital. So this is really critical to use a mixed method approach, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that. So just to think about some of the different options you could have when you're deciding how to focus on the SDGs, what you're going to evaluate. So here along the top, you could have a very narrow focus on a particular target. In the example there is the SDG 5.2, combating violence against women. You could focus on a single SDG, on education, food, transport, gender, one of the environmental dimensions. You could look at a group of SDGs, or you could look at all of the SDGs in a particular country or a particular region. So in this first example, you decide to take a narrow one target of an SDG 5.2, the violence against women, and you look at that at the relationship between the national program, how that operates at the different regions, and how it operates at the local level. So here you've got a narrow focus, not that combating violence against women should be considered narrow, but within the SDG framework it's just one of the sub-targets. So there you've got a narrow focus, and you're looking at it at all of the different levels. A second option is that you may say, we want to look at the interactions between a group of SDGs in a particular country or region. For example, it could be poverty, food, health, and education, how they all affect women and children's health. So there you take a broader focus with a group of SDGs, and again you look at them at the different levels. Or you could decide you're going to look at all of the SDGs in a particular country, or you could look at one SDG in a country. Here we're looking at the combined impacts of all of the SDGs on a particular outcome of women's empowerment. So there you're just working at the national level, but across all of the SDGs in that particular country. So as you can see, these are very critical decisions. The approach you take there is going to be very, very different, and you need to think through to make sure that the approach you're using is appropriate to what it is you're looking at. One of the dangers with a lot of the SDGs, as with a lot of other evaluations, is that you just work at the national level. You sit in the office of the Ministry of Planning, or the Ministry of Education, or the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Women's Affairs, and the ministry shows you all of the beautiful plans. They have how they're going to be having all of the educational programs are going to be promoted in a participatory way at the regional level and at the local level. And so sometimes you just do an evaluation sitting in the office, and you look at the emails they've had communicating with the different agencies, and you think this program goes very well, it's very well planned. However, if you actually go out to the local levels, you find nobody's heard of this program, or they say, we wanted to participate, but we sent some requests, but we never ever heard back. So all plans look very beautiful when you're sitting in the minister's office. When you actually get out into the field, this may not be the case. So even if your main focus is just on the national plan, try to get out into the field and go to some of the villages. I've been involved, as I'm sure you have, in many evaluations where when you suggest we really need to go down to the villages and see what's happening, people in the central office, they roll up their eyes and say, it's all right for your academics who have unlimited resources, you can go out to the village, but we have a tight budget, so we can't afford to go to the village. And so sometimes really nobody knows what's actually happening at the village level, but the evaluation report says everything is excellent because we've got this beautiful plan. So try, even if it's only on a fairly limited basis, to get out of the office and see what is actually happening in the field. Then remember, whichever SDG you're particularly interested in, this is interacting with all of the other SDGs, or certainly with a number of the other SDGs. So you need to try to think using some of the analysis we showed, the systems analysis. What are the essential interactions of your program with your SDG or sub-SDG with the other SDGs? Are there positive interactions? Are there negative interactions? Are there some bottlenecks that it's very difficult to get your school feeding program going because there's problems of coordination with the Ministry of Transport to improve the school bus system so that the kids can actually get to school to even have the school breakfast. So looking at the bottlenecks, some of the strangulation points, and some of the multiply effects. If you focus on education, this may promote agricultural programs, increasing the demand for food. It may have effects on health, may have effects in a number of other areas. So always, however narrow the terms of reference, look at what the interactions are going to be with the other SDGs and what are the critical points you need to be looking at. And then understanding some of the risks and the challenges. Are the dangers that a particular group is going to take control of the program and exclude other groups? There may be issues of ethnicity, there may be regional issues, and so on. So understand the power dynamics of who is controlling the program, who may be excluded. Then always be aware of the unintended outcomes. All programs have many outcomes which go beyond the specific targets. Many of these may be positive and are being ignored. Some of them may be negative and again get ignored. So really try and understand the unintended outcomes. And then also understand that there may be some trade-offs. That if you have limited resources, there may be some trade-offs between whether you invest in improving school transport or in money for school breakfast. So identify and think how you can negotiate some of these trade-offs, or competition between the Ministry of Transport, who says what we really need is more school buses, and the Ministry of Agriculture said no, what we need is better food for the school breakfast. So understand these risks and the challenges. So just finally, a few of the practical considerations when planning the evaluation. Firstly, how much relevant data can we collect? You may have beautiful ideas, but a lot of the data may not be available. Please note the word relevant. It's not just how much data can we collect, it's how much relevant data can we collect. Maybe we can collect a lot of data, but do we have the capacity to analyze it? There's no point having an office full of data if you're not able to analyze it. How much can stakeholders absorb and understand? You may have the capacity to produce some beautiful systems maps, but can your stakeholders, will they be able to understand this? So this is supposed to be used. It's not just to do a beautiful analysis. So think again, what are people going to be able to understand and use? The question of the boundaries. Again, thinking, try to avoid having too narrow boundaries. Even if your client says, we mainly want to just focus on the specific population that we're affecting, try to find at least some time to look at what the effects are on the broader communities. There may be all sorts of benefits which are being ignored. There may be some problems. We've talked a lot about the issues of boundaries and how they affect accountability. So then a basic idea is to start simple and see how far you can go, rather than starting with an incredible plan which can never be implemented. Start maybe in a few villages, a few areas, and then gradually expand the scope of the evaluation when you can understand what you're capable of doing and what people are interested in. And then multiple voices. It's not just a Minister of Education who decides what are educational issues. It's people in the communities. It's people who are excluded from the schools. So always make sure that you have multiple voices. And as we've reminded you of using the mixed methods approach. So to wrap up, there are 3 key building blocks for an SDG evaluation. Emergence, remembering that the programs you're evaluating, they're constantly changing. You need to have a dynamic evaluation so you can capture these changes. So you're evaluating what is actually happening, not what the program was 3 years ago when it was being planned. So emergence, voice and agency, make sure that you're listening to all of the different groups who are affected by the program and not just the funding agency or the ministry. And then mixed methods, which we've mentioned and keep coming back to. So before you start your SDG evaluation, please put a picture on the wall of these 3 factors and make sure as your evaluation is evolving that you're keeping those in mind. So thank you. This is the main part of the presentation. I'll pass you back to Kassem. And then if we have time, I'd like a few minutes to go through the example of a complexity evaluation looking at the program to combat violence against women. That will probably take 5 to 10 minutes to go through. So if we have time, we'll talk about that towards the end. If not, it's in the slides and we can send it to you afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you again, Michael. I hope we'll have the time even to dive deep into the example. So let me open the floor for our participants, and I'd like to probably to mention that the last slide, it's nailed perfectly and properly, given the emergence of dynamics and being attentive and adaptive and reactive to the voice of the communities of different sorts and using the different methods. Any quick reactions from the floor? Any thought that's worth to be shared? Clarifications to the 3 blocks of that Michael is trying to share with us? Probably it's worth to call upon our colleague Dorothy again to give us a bit of kind of reflection on what we've been hearing so far. If she's Dorothy, are you still there?
Yes, because I'm always here.
Great, and this will allow a bit of time for our colleagues probably to think through and to reflect on what Michael has been discussing since the morning. So probably a brief of 3, 4, 5 minutes of ideas and reflection on what we've heard so far.
Sure. Michael, I was very interested, and thank you as always for a very thought-provoking presentation, and I'm sure our participants are also considering the depth of the material that you've presented. One of the things that I was considering is, where does the points that you've been presenting, where does that differ from standard evaluation practice. So in terms of defining the focus, that's something that in evaluation we've always done. So we've looked at the evaluand, and evaluation training always talks about defining the boundaries and making sure that your evaluand is very clear. But it seems to me that what you're saying is that don't just look at the evaluand, don't just look at what you're evaluating, look at the connections and understand the connections in what you're evaluating, and then examine those connections in more depth. So there's a lot of discussion at the moment in relation to the SDGs around nexus points between different SDGs and how you can actually focus in between different SDGs on the kind of trade-offs that are going on between SDGs. And that seems to be a particularly productive way to explore some of those interactions. So I did wonder if you had any more comments on some of those initiatives that are going on in the SDGs place about the nexus between the SDGs, and that would be a way to give us emergence. And the last point, I share Elle Stern's, Elle, I'm not sure what your first name is. That was a very good point about evaluation. There's a time lag between what is being done and what is being evaluated, and given the high level of dynamism in the system. Oh, Linda, thank you. So Linda, your point about how do you deal with the time lag in a dynamic situation is one that I think is a very good one. And so, Michael, if you've got any more points around that, then the point about emergence that you have there, that would be very helpful to say, how do we look at dynamism when often there's a lag in what we're doing? So there's just a couple of reflections. And in fact, there are more questions.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. And allow me to add probably another 2 questions from the floor, and then give Michael the chance to address them all together. Another 2 questions that came up from the floor, one pertaining to an advice to the government entities by our colleague, by Carlos, saying, what advice can you give us for us to communicate with the government entities and government officials, especially in letting them understand the complexity of what we're doing? And the second interesting question also that pertains to the sampling method. It's a bit of method related, but basically, what are the sampling method that you would advise us to use in order to ensure representation in those voices? Is it a purposive sampling versus random sampling? What are your thoughts in this regard?
So shall I try to respond to a few of those, and then we can maybe have some more questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you. So, well, thank you as always. These are very interesting, important questions, and people have in mind the practicalities of how can you convince governments it's useful to do this? Is there anything new or different from what we're already doing? How can you actually make this useful by providing feedback in a timely manner rather than just getting a beautiful evaluation report 3 years later when the program's finished and nothing can be done with it? So these are very, very practical and very helpful questions. So the first question from Dorothy, I always get scared when Dorothy asks questions because they're always very hard ones to respond to, very thoughtful questions. So how does this differ from the conventional ways that we do evaluation? So none of these techniques are completely new. Perhaps it's a new framework of how you put them together. But the example I like to to begin thinking about this, if we take the example, which we'll maybe talk about it a little bit later if we have time, on the program for the evaluating program to combat violence against women, a program there may typically have perhaps 4 or 5 different components. It may have some providing technical assistance to the police on how to process complaints about violence. It may have some training programs for the community. It may have some awareness raising programs in the schools. You may be doing some work with the mass media. And so very often when you do a separate conventional evaluation of each of these programs, they all get a very positive evaluation. The police like the technical assistance they were given. They said it was very helpful. The schools have been using the orientation you give on violence, and the teachers said this was very, very positive. The mass media has adopted a lot of the information you've given, and this is being used widely in the mass media. The training programs at the community level were considered very good. So when you look at the conventional evaluation report, you may find that each of the components was rated very well, and you say this program was great, it was a great success, we should repeat it. However, if you actually ask the question, is there any evidence that this has had any impact in any way at all on violence against women, you will often find it's not possible to detect any reduction in violence against women. So why is that? Because the total effect is not just adding the individual interventions, it's understanding those interventions within the broader context of the relationships between the different ministries, the attitudes to violence in a particular country, the fact that making girls more aware of issues of violence doesn't stop the violence happening. So I think this is the big distinction, that even if all of the individual components of your program have been rated successful, this doesn't mean that you're making any contribution to the broader goals, such as the SDG on violence against women. And what you're trying to ask with the complexity analysis of why is that? And it's because of these broader systems analysis, dimensions, the fact that there are contextual factors affecting the program, there are political factors, the government may have other priorities. So just to give one example from Central America with the program on violence, one contextual factor, in many of the countries they've been recovering, in El Salvador for example, from civil war, and so there's just a very high level of general violence throughout the country. All of the fighters have now been reintegrated into the system, but they can't find jobs, so they've been creating gangs. And so a lot of people say violence against women is really important, but we have to leave that for the moment, because the really big problem is the general violence of people being killed in the streets by the gangs. So that would be an example. If you look at the contextual factor of the broader way that people think about violence, that might be explaining why your program may have had less effect than you. This is just a hypothetical example. I'm not saying the program there didn't have an effect, but so this is probably one of the big differences, the fact that there are these broader contextual factors, these systemic factors which affect how your program operates. So that would probably be one of the biggest differences. And then the second one would be, as Dorothy's pointing out, the nexus points, the relationship between the different SDGs, that however successful you had a program in one SDG, the outcomes are going to be very much limited if you don't have coordination with the other SDGs. They may be limiting the effects. So the second thing is the need to look at this sort of broader context. So that's a second factor. And then the third one, which again is not new, but introducing it more systematically, is the question of emergence. So many conventional evaluation designs, not all of them, but have a baseline study and then you measure what the conditions were at the beginning of the program, you come back at the end and you repeat the measurements without realizing that the program has completely changed. So unless you have an emergence focus understanding that programs are constantly changing, many conventional evaluation methods will be missing what is actually happening in the real world. Not all of them, and I'm sure Dorothy can tell you many of the dynamic techniques which are being used, which are addressing these issues. But those are just a couple of the general points. Very quickly on the other issues, the time lag, very critical. One of the things which you mentioned with some of the systems analysis approaches, that you can be getting continual feedback. You can be looking at the communication linkages between different agencies, and you may find there are some weaknesses of some agencies which are not involved in the communication networks. And if you're able to update this analysis, you can provide rapid feedback to the agencies on what are the issues. With the example of the dynamic feedback loops with the micro loan program, again, you can show some of the reasons that the demand for loans may be falling because of the understanding some of these feedback loops. When the requirements of the lending agencies become more complex, more demanding, maybe less people will request loans. So there's a number of techniques for providing some rapid feedback. And one thing which I haven't mentioned, but I just like to put on the table for maybe some future discussions, the new kinds of big data and data analytics make this kind of feedback very much more possible. Just to mention one example, the social media analysis. There's lots of things you can do now with analyzing Twitter or Facebook or all of the other WhatsApp, where you can provide constant feedback on people's attitudes. What are they talking about with relationship to violence against women or climate or whatever you're concerned with? So there are a number of ways that you can provide more rapid feedback, but that is critical to use techniques to provide feedback at a time when it can be used. So what do we tell governments? What you don't tell governments is that complexity analysis is incredibly complex, and we're going to use all of these fancy systems analysis approaches. That's just going to scare off governments. They say, we don't have the resources even to do simple evaluations. There's no way we can use this. We don't even understand what you're talking about. So what you need to do is what some people call low-hanging fruits. You try to identify some examples of useful findings which you can produce fairly quickly and fairly cheaply, without being threatening, so that people can see there are useful things you can, for example, if you can show some of the reasons that your school feeding program is not working well because of some of the issues of the public transport is not working too well, so the children can't get to the school to actually have the meals, even if they would like to. So if you can show government some quick benefits, that can be a helpful way of getting them involved. So that's one issue. Another is this question of the unanticipated outcomes. Many of those can be very positive, that if you can show your programs having benefits over a much wider population than the original target, that can be attractive to government. So think from their point of view, that show them the kind of benefits which can be produced, and then you say, well, this is going to need some new techniques to get this information, but get them interested. That would be useful. I'd really like to know how we could get more people in the school feeding program, or get farmers to adopt the new kinds of seed. And then when they say that, this is really interesting, and then when they ask you, how could you do this? Then you say, well, there's a lot of new techniques which are coming in, which can be done in a user-friendly way. So just try to think from their point of view. Then the final question about the sampling methods, you probably are going to want to use some kind of purposive sampling of where you identify all of the groups that can be affected by the program, and think how you can make sure that they are involved. And
the social exclusion framework is a very important way of doing this. Of many evaluations focus on who is benefiting from the program, but they don't look at who is being ignored. So having some kind of framework for systematically thinking who are the groups who are not benefiting from your program or who may even be worse off, and then just think how you could sample them. It may be purposively, it may be that you need to do some quantitative sampling techniques, it may be that you use social media analysis for identifying people, maybe you use some of the new techniques with satellite images or whatever to detect communities which you haven't been studying. But that is really critical to make sure that you are giving voice to all of the different groups affected by the program. So those are just a few ideas on some of the initial questions. So back to you, Kassem.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael. And I think once we move into the third part, the final part of the webinar, things would hopefully would be much clearer to our participants and the audience. Allow me to probably ask you. Let's continue with the case study. Spending 10 minutes on that, and then open the floor for another 10 minutes for feedback and thought.
So Kassem, please remind me when I've come up to the 10 minutes, because I want to leave time for you to wrap up and any final questions. So this is an example of, it's a hypothetical example, but based upon a real example of a 10-year program to combat violence against women in a Central American country. The program used a lot of awareness-raising techniques, and so this is having people out in the streets saying no more violence against women. So they used a lot of very innovative approaches for trying to raise awareness. But the program, it was a 10-year program. Which was, the goal was to put in place mechanisms to reduce violence against women over a 10-year period. And it worked at the Central American level, looking at issues like migration and cross-border conflict. At the national level, trying to influence Congress, ministries, media. Selected a number of municipalities where it was working, worked with the police to try to train them on how to respond to complaints of violence, worked in individual communities and a number of activities at the level of the household and individual. Complex program, working at a lot of different levels with a lot of different groups, with interaction between all of the different components. So the program components, some of them were demonstration programs in 7 municipalities, like, for example, improving the way the police respond to violent accusations of violence. Promoting critical thinking, getting agencies to be able to write better proposals, focusing on programs to address violence, in this case to convince to change some of the laws. Political advocacy, for example, legal and policy reform, using the mass media, mass media campaigns, awareness raising and women's empowerment at the community level. So a number of different components, and we used the 5-step evaluation approach of identifying the different dimensions of complexity, then identifying some components which the program could be broken into, individual components which were easier to evaluate, then thinking of the best evaluation methods for the individual components, and then the challenge of reassembling the program again after you've looked at the individual components and getting back to the big picture, remembering that each of the individual programs could be evaluated as working well, but when you look at the big picture, maybe there's been no overall effect. So this was a program evolving over a 10-year period in three phases, more or less. So we began with using the systems analysis. This was the example which we gave you before, of understanding all of the actors, how they interact with each other. Then we thought about what could be some of the components that into which we could unpack the program for doing case studies, evaluations. So you could look at the programs, how they affected the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Education. You could do a case on that particular component. You could look at how it worked in particular municipalities, in particular police districts. You could have a sample of local communities. You could look at some of the advocacy campaigns. You could test hypotheses coming from your theory of change. So the idea is you break down a complex program into individual components.
each of which can be evaluated using some of the standard evaluation methods that you're familiar with. So some of the techniques which were used, case-based comparisons of municipalities with and without the program, analysis of some of the social media campaigns to see what changes there were in information or attitudes, rapid household surveys in communities to look at the effects of the awareness raising, social network analysis to look at changes in group structures, communication patterns, leadership on issues relating to gender and gender-based violence, and participant observation, somebody actually spending time in the police stations to observe what actually happens when women come in to complain about sexual harassment. So there's a number of different, basically you can use any of the conventional evaluation methods which are appropriate. And so this is the advantage of this approach. You break down a complex program which needs very complex evaluation systems into individual components where you can use the evaluation methods that you're familiar with, but then remembering you have to build this back up again to look at the big picture. So some of the issues you have to be thinking about when you go back to the big picture, emergence, the program is changing, so you have to evaluate how it's working now, not how it was working 3 years ago. Spillover, it may be having benefits on a much wider group than you had expected. Displacement effects, it may be that it's not benefiting some of the groups that you intended. For example, a school feeding program is intended to benefit the schools and the children. It may end up benefiting mainly the farmers who are producing and selling the food to the schools. Coordination issues, a program, each individual component may work well, but the problems of coordination between the different agencies. Understanding the issues of policy coherence. Most countries don't have very coherent overall policy, so it may be that the national government doesn't have the capacity to be putting together all of these different components. So you need to look at the internal policy coherence within a ministry. Historically, do you have consistent policy over time? Horizontal relationships between different ministries. Is there a standard policy on combating violence across all ministries? Vertical, how does it operate at the different levels within a ministry? So these are some of the issues when you're thinking of going back to the big picture. And then finally, across the top, the orange boxes are what you would find with a conventional evaluation. You look at the findings of the components of the evaluation, and then you put those components together and look at the overall outcomes. But when we do a complexity evaluation, we look at all of these boxes at the bottom, the emergence, policy coordination, coordination between different ministries, and the 4 dimensions of complexity, which we talked about. The intervention itself may be complex, organizational dynamics, the issues of causality, they're not linear. Anyone who works on gender is familiar with this 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You advance women's empowerment, and then this creates some negative feedback, and some of the benefits may be lost looking at these broader contextual factors. So when you bring in these complexity dimensions, you can see that some of the findings you may have just had along the top get changed. Some of the results you thought you'd achieved, they don't actually seem to be continuing to benefit at the broader level because all of these different factors. So this is essentially what you're trying to do with the complexity analysis, take into fact all of these broader factors and dimensions and the context. So thank you, and wishing you success with your SDG evaluation. So this was just a very quick example, but basically giving the message it is possible to apply these techniques in the real world. So over to you, Kasem.
Thank you, Michael. And I think the case study illustrates a lot and addresses many of the questions that were raised in the sidebar. I mean, obviously, there is a question that has to do with the evaluation of the SDGs under time and budget constraints. This is something that's probably worth to be looked at. Meanwhile, I'll be calling our colleagues probably to raise any comments or reflections. I mean, we still have a couple of minutes left before we wrap it up.
have a question.
Yes, Ada, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a simple but probably a question that I recurrently receive. Mike, is there a direct relationship between evaluating the SDGs with the framework you have just explained to us, kindly explained to us, and has been very useful, and the cost of the evaluations? I have received various questions in the sense that the reaction from governments normally complexity, evaluating complexity means huge evaluations, costly evaluations that probably they cannot afford to do. What are your comments and reactions to that? Thank you. Thank you, Kassem. Merci beaucoup.
Do you want to take any other questions, Kassem, or shall I respond to Ada?
Probably, in addition to Ada's question, there is another question on tips for addressing complexity while evaluating under budget and time constraints, which basically speaks to Ada's comment on the budget too. So go ahead.
Excuse me. Okay, so this is a very good, very important questions. I think one of the problems with complexity evaluation has been that many of the people who develop complexity come from a systems analysis background, not from an evaluation background, and a lot of them tend to present very sophisticated, very complex, and potentially very expensive approaches. So a lot of people have got frightened away, believing firstly that these are going to be too difficult to understand or use, and that they're going to be too expensive. So I think going back to some of the practical tips we gave of starting on a small scale and seeing, thinking about how much data can you collect, how much can you analyze, how much can your stakeholders absorb, and taking things which are sort of manageable and then broadening the scope if the resources permit. So I think that's just thinking really what are the critical issues that people want to address, and narrowing in on those is an important starting point. There are a lot of very simple ways that you can begin to think about complexity without having to increase the cost. Just having this framework with the 4 dimensions of complexity, having a checklist for giving some indicators of how complex your program is in terms of the program itself, in terms of the coordination with other agencies. So even if you aren't able to do any additional kinds of data collection, at least you have a framework where you can be asking yourself some questions like what are some of the contextual factors which might be affecting the success of this program. It always surprises me how many evaluators completely forget about the context. They just look at the school feeding program, they just talk to the parents, to the teachers, and they don't even look at the fact there's a civil war that's been going on in the country, or that a lot of kids don't come to school because they're just frightened of the violence, or the girls don't come to school because they have to walk through the village and they get teased by the boys and they feel embarrassed. So even very, very basic contextual factors, you can take these into account with this kind of simple checklist. You can get into more complicated kinds of analysis if you have the resources. One of the things which I think evaluators haven't done very much, which I think is really critical, is just to look at these new kinds of big data, the new kinds of information which are available, because there's lots of ways that you can collect information very much more cheaply using big data. I just mentioned social media analysis is one example, but if you have a program on a large scale, you can get very high resolution satellite images free from NASA, for example, or the Google Maps. So this can enable you to track migration patterns, how villages are expanding, even things like the condition of the roads. So at the moment,
evaluators tend not to be using big data. They tend to rely still on their conventional evaluation methods. So there are a number of potential new data sources which enable you to collect new kinds of data without necessarily having to increase the cost. You need to have somebody who understands how to use these big data. You can't just call up NASA and say, please send us some satellite images and then think you're going to be able to analyze them. But there just aren't many resources available which can be used. So that's something to keep in mind. And also a lot of these techniques, some of these real-time feedback mechanisms also address the question of these are dynamic programs which are evolving, and you need to provide feedback as a program is being implemented. So just sort of sit back and think about whether there are new kinds of data you can collect. On the basic nuts and bolts of how to collect data with a limited budget, I worked a little bit with some of my colleagues on real-world evaluation. There's a range of ways that you can reduce the cost of data collection. You can't collect data magically without any cost, but there are ways that you can reduce the costs. And so particularly when you get into complexity, just think that it is going to be possible to use some of these systems analysis and so on without it having to be hugely expensive. So it's not necessarily very easy to use these initially, but they can be done, and there are people around who can help you with some of these things. So just sort of broaden your horizons and think there may be new ways that you can collect this data. But the very simple, if you don't have any more resources, just think about this sort of framework of using this complexity checklist and having this map to look at of the different dimensions, and at least keep those in mind to think, are any of these factors affecting our program and how it's achieving it or not achieving its outcomes.
Thank you. Probably there is another question probably that's worth a minute or two of your time before we call it a meeting. To what extent would you think that the theory of change would help would help in this context of addressing the complexity issue, and how would you deal with the use of technical language like the theory of change, system analysis, when reporting on your evaluation findings to the government? Because the argument here is that governments would be a bit skeptical about these big buzzwords of complexity systems and etc. So, what advice would you give us? Would you give in this regard on the use of the technical language?
Thank you. That's an important issue. Whether you're talking about using randomized controlled trials or complexity or whatever, there's a danger that sometimes evaluators try to impress governments with how clever they are, what long words they use, all the technical concepts, and that's going to be fatal. So what you try to do, for example, if you're talking about systems analysis, actually develop with the example of the violence against women. If you come up with a systems map relating to the particular context in which the government is working, they can understand this. The idea, if you just have a theoretical systems map, we need to understand interactions between different agents. They have no idea what you're talking about. But if you say, here's the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Education, they need to be able to coordinate on this program of violence, and sometimes the police and the communities don't get on well together. If you bring it down to that level, governments understand what you're talking about. If you're using social network analysis and you're showing how you could use this at the community level to understand who are the opinion leaders, what are the different cliques within a community. Again, if you give a specific example, governments can understand this. So if you're trying to help them to understand what this really means, rather than trying to impress them, I think it can be done. The complexity checklist again is another helpful example. If you're talking about what might be the complex dimensions of the program you're implementing, if you get down to indicators like does everybody agree on what are the objectives of the program, or is there a lot of disagreement? And we think in this case there's quite a lot of disagreement, so we're giving it a score of 4 on the complexity scale of up to 5. People can understand that. You know, does the program have a lot of different components? Are the components well tested, or are they new? When you get down to a real example, I think that people can understand this quite well, and particularly if you give specific examples, and also trying to think of showing the benefits of this, the low-hanging fruit. So if the minister says, well, this is very nice, but I don't see how we could actually use it, if you can then immediately come back and with a specific example of new things that you found out. So starting from the point of view of your clients and not trying to frighten them, but trying to show this is something useful to them. Most agencies like to use new techniques. It makes them look modern and sophisticated. So there's a lot of appeal of using new techniques if they understand it and don't find them frightening. So just keep that in mind. And then the theory of change. Theory of change can potentially be used for getting into complexity analysis, but a lot of theories of change are traditionally very linear. They just say, you know, here are the inputs. These are how they're going to be used for these activities. These are the outputs or the products that will produce these outcomes. It's all done in a very linear way. So you need to rethink the theory of change to put it within a complexity focus. You can do it, but it needs some reformulating. But I think that, as always, the theory of change is potentially a very useful tool.
Yeah, thank you so much for the thought-provoking and the insightful comments and feedback, Michael. I personally enjoyed the discussion. I mean, this is for the second round that it has been very, very helpful. I mean, yes, it didn't answer. It probably didn't answer a lot of questions, but it helped us in reflecting on many cases and instances. And this is the beauty of such webinar. Providing the platform and the opportunity to reflect and to think. I hope that we can find a way of probably addressing the questions that will be coming up from the floor in one way or another through the network. I'd like to thank you so much. I'd like to thank the participants, 120 something for today. And quickly, I want to confirm that the webinar is recorded, and the recording along with the presentation will be floated and will be distributed soon to the network. Thank you again. Thank you, Ada and Celeste and the team for the collaboration and the facilitation. Any final comments, Ada, from your end before we call it a meeting?
Thank you very much, Kasem, Dorothy, and thank you very much, Mike, for coming all the way to New York to sit with us and to interact with us. I would only add that those who would like to continue the discussion in general of evaluation and SDGs are very welcome to join Eval SDGs. And how to join Eval SDGs, Celeste, you can type the website and you will find there, or just contact directly Dorothy, Kasem, or Ada. We will be happy to have you in that safe forum. Thank you very much to all of you on behalf of UNICEF and Eval SDGs, and we look forward to continue interacting and working with you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Lovely day.